Close your eyes if you'd like, or simply let your gaze go soft, resting on nothing in particular. Let your body settle wherever you are. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest open and still. There's nothing you need to do right now, nothing to hold on to. For the next little while, you are simply here, listening and resting. Tonight we are going to a mountain in Japan, not a famous mountain, not the kind that appears on paintings and postcards and the sides of fans, but a particular mountain, a range of mountains, on the border between what is now Kanagawa and Shizuoka prefectures, where the land rises steeply from the Kanto Plain into the old volcanic peaks of the Hakone region. These mountains are called Ashigara. They are old mountains, covered in cedar and oak and maple, crossed by the ancient road that travelers walked for centuries between the eastern provinces and the capital in Kyoto, and they have the quality of mountains that have been lived among for a very long time, a settled presence, a density of accumulated history that you can feel in the silence between the trees. In these mountains, a long time ago, a boy grew up. His name was Kintaro. Kin, gold, Taro, first son, the golden boy. He was large for his age, large from the beginning, in the way of children who arrive in the world with more physical energy than the usual amount, who grow quickly and move through the world with a particular ease of body that comes from having been given more body to work with. He carried a masakari, the broad-bladed axe of the woodcutters and the mountain workers, on his shoulder. He wore a red bib in the style of small children, the bright red that Japanese parents dressed their young children in, the color of health and energy, and the warding off of bad luck. He rode a bear, not reluctantly, not as someone who has been placed on the back of a large animal against their will, but as someone for whom riding a bear was simply the most convenient way of getting around the mountain. Kintaro is a boy of May. In Japan, the 5th day of the 5th month, Children's Day, once called Boys' Day, is the day that Kintaro's image appears throughout the country, on the helmets and armor of the decorative warrior dolls displayed in households with young sons, on the koinobori, the carp-shaped streamers that fly from poles above houses and bridges and parks in the warm wind of early May. The koinobori, the carp streamers, are one of the most distinctive visual traditions of Japanese spring. Large carp shapes, made of cloth or paper, strung on poles and caught by the wind, so that they fill and swim in the moving air in the particular way of something that is part fish, part flag, part the memory of a principle. The carp that swims upstream, that works against the current, that does not take the easy path but pushes upward with the quality of a creature that has decided where it is going and intends to get there. This is the virtue that Boys' Day celebrates, not just physical strength, not just the warrior's courage, but the quality of persistence, of working against resistance, of growing up into difficulty and not being defeated by it. Kintaro is the embodiment of this quality. He grew up on a mountain without a father, with only his mother and the forest for company. He became strong, not despite these circumstances, but through them, shaped by the particular demands of the particular life he was given. The dolls displayed on Children's Day, the warrior figures in their lacquered armor, the helmet with its decorative crest, often include Kintaro. He appears in his characteristic form, red, round-faced, exuberant, the axe over his shoulder, the energy visible in every line of him. And he appears as a wish as much as a representation. The wish that the child who will grow up in this house will grow up with this quality, with the strength and the openness and the ease in the world that Kintaro had, and will find, as Kintaro found, that these qualities open doors that no amount of cleverness or caution can open in quite the same way. His mother was a woman named Yaegiri. She had come to the mountain the way that people sometimes come to remote places, not because the mountain was her destination, but because circumstances had made it the place where she needed to be. Her husband had died. She had returned to her family's land in the foothills of Ashigara, and she had built a life there, in the particular way of people who have been given a difficult set of circumstances and have responded not with bitterness, but with the practical determination of someone who needs to raise a child and intends to do so. The mountain provided. This is one of the qualities of the old mountain landscapes of Japan that the folk tales understood well. The mountain is not simply a backdrop, not simply the setting for human events, but a provider, an active participant in the lives of the people who live on it. Food came from the mountain, wood came from the mountain, water came from the mountain springs, and in Kintaro's case, companionship came from the mountain, from the creatures who shared the slopes and the forests with the small family of the woman and her remarkable son. Yaegiri watched Kintaro grow. He grew quickly, as children with his particular energy tend to do, and he grew toward the mountain, not away from it, not in the direction of the villages in the valley and the world below, but upward, into the forests, and the streams, and the open slopes above the tree line, where the mountain showed its own face most clearly. He knew the mountain, the way that a child who grows up in a particular landscape comes to know it, not as a series of named places on a map, but as a living thing, known in the way of things known through the body, the particular steepness of this slope, the way this stream sounds in spring versus autumn, the places where the bears go when the weather changes, and the places where they can be found when it is time to find them. Kintaro's mother. In some versions of the story, the older versions, the versions that came before the standardized folk tale of the Meiji era, Kintaro's mother is not simply a woman who happened to be living on the mountain. She is a Yamauba, a mountain woman, a mountain witch, the particular figure of the Japanese folk tradition who lives in the mountains and is associated with both danger and wisdom, with the wild world outside the settled order of the village. The Yamauba is one of the most ambiguous figures in Japanese folk belief. She is not simply evil, not the straightforward villain of the stories that need straightforward villains, but something more complicated, a figure of the boundary between the human world and the wild world, who has some characteristics of each and belongs entirely to neither. She knows the mountain. She knows the forest. She knows what grows there and what moves through it, and what the seasons bring and take. This knowledge is not human knowledge, not the knowledge of the farmer or the woodcutter or the person who crosses the mountain on the road from one place to another, but the deeper knowledge of someone who has been there long enough to become part of what is there. If Kintaro's mother was a Yamauba, or had some of the qualities of the Yamaoba, then Kintaro's nature makes more sense. He is not simply a very strong boy. He is the child of the mountain itself, or of something that belongs to the mountain in a way that ordinary people do not. And his ease with the bears and the deer and the other animals, his capacity to live in the forest without the discomfort that forests produce in people who are not truly of them, is not something he learned but something he was born with. The standardized folk tale softened this element, made Yaegiri a woman with a specific history and a specific reason for being on the mountain, but the older quality is still there in the story, in Kintaro's relationship with the mountain and its creatures, in the sense that this boy is not quite ordinary, is something that the mountain produced, rather than something that merely arrived there and stayed. The house where Kintaro grew up was a mountain house, the kind of house that exists at the edge of the settled world, where the village ends and the forest begins, where the sounds of the night are the sounds of the mountain rather than the sounds of other people. Mountain houses in Japan are built for the mountain, for the cold and the snow, for the steep slopes that mean every flat surface has been chosen carefully, and every wall must hold against the weight of winter. They are built of the mountain's materials, cedar and pine and camphor, the wood that the forest provides, shaped by the knowledge accumulated over generations of people who have learned how to make a shelter that the mountain will accept, that will stand through the winters and the heavy snows and the occasional storm that comes off the Pacific and moves through the peaks with the kind of force that reminds you that you are living at the pleasure of the weather. Yaegiri kept the house. This was the ordinary work of the mountain household, the daily maintenance of a space that the mountain was always trying to reclaim, the leaves that accumulated, the wood that needed stacking, the roof that needed checking after each heavy snow. She cooked on the irori, the central hearth, the sunken fire pit at the heart of the traditional Japanese house, around which the family gathered in the evenings for warmth and food, and the particular quality of conversation that firelight produces, slower, softer, more likely to arrive at the things that matter. In the evenings, Kintaro came home, from the forest and the mountain, from the day's exertions, the wrestling and the climbing, and the particular physical life of a boy who spent his days in the full presence of the physical world, and the house received him with warmth and food, and the presence of his mother, who was, in the end, the fixed point around which the mountain life organized itself. He was of the mountain, but he came home. This is the distinction that the story quietly maintains between belonging to the wild and belonging to the people who love you, and Kintaro belonged to both, which is perhaps the most that any person can hope for, to be fully in the world and fully at home. The animals of Ashigara were Kintaro's companions. This is said simply, as if it were natural, as if the friendship between a boy and the bears and deer and monkeys and rabbits of a mountain forest required no explanation, and in the world of the old stories, it does not. In that world, the boundary between the human and the animal is more permeable than it appears in ordinary life, is a boundary that certain people can cross, or that dissolves in the presence of certain qualities, openness, strength, the absence of fear. Kintaro had all of these. The bear was his particular companion. Bears in Japan, the Asian black bear, and, in Hokkaido, the brown bear, are large animals, larger than a person, with the particular kind of physical presence that large animals have. The density of weight, the quality of force contained in stillness, the particular awareness that a creature this size brings to the space it occupies. Kintaro was not afraid of bears, not because he did not understand what a bear was, but because his own physical scale and his own physical energy were of a kind that made the encounter feel less like a confrontation and more like a meeting between two creatures who were each, in their own way, of the mountain. They played together. The games they played were the games of physical creatures, testing strength, the particular pleasure of finding out what the body can do in competition with something that provides genuine resistance. Kintaro and the bear would wrestle, the boy and the large animal locked together in the particular absorbed struggle of two things that are genuinely matched, and neither was always the winner, which is the precondition for the game continuing to be worth playing. The other animals came too, deer and monkey and rabbit, the various creatures of the Ashigara forest, and they gathered around Kintaro in the way of animals who have found a human being they are not afraid of, who have learned that this particular presence means neither threat nor indifference, but something more like company. The forest in summer. The cedar forests of the Japanese mountains in summer have a particular quality, a quality of fullness, of the world having arrived at its maximum expression of green and growing and the accumulation of life. The cedars themselves, sugi, the Japanese cedar that is the most planted and the most present of Japan's forest trees, are tall, dark, densely spaced, their trunks rising straight for many meters before branching, the canopy they form so complete that the light below is always the filtered light of something that has passed through many layers. In this light, the forest floor is a particular place, moss-covered, cool, the sound of water from the many small streams that run through the mountains always present somewhere nearby. Kintaro lived in this light. The summers of his childhood, the years before the samurai appeared, were summers in the forest. The particular quality of forest mornings, when the light first comes through and the temperature has not yet built, and everything has the freshness of something that rested well through the night and is beginning again. He would go out early, before his mother was fully awake, with the axe over his shoulder and the mountain ahead of him, the bear somewhere nearby, the day beginning in the particular way of days that have no fixed shape, that are available to whatever presents itself. The sounds of the summer forest, the cicadas, the sound that is summer in Japan more than any other, the sustained, all-surrounding note of the higurashi and the kumazemi, filling the air with a sound that is both very loud and completely natural, that you hear constantly and stop noticing, and then, when it stops, notice its absence immediately. The water, always the water, the streams and the waterfalls that are everywhere in these mountains, the sound of water that has been falling since before any person was alive to hear it, the wind in the high cedar, the particular sound of wind in tall trees, different from the wind in bamboo, different from the wind in pine. The cedar's own sound, low and continuous, the sound of the mountain breathing. Sumo, the wrestling that Kintaro practices with his bear and with the other animals and with any traveler who happened to pass and was willing to test themselves against a child who was stronger than anyone expected, is not simply wrestling, it is sumo. Sumo is Japan's oldest sport. Its origins are in the Shinto tradition, in the ritual wrestling performed at shrines as an offering to the gods, as a way of determining which side of a dispute the gods favored, as a celebration of harvest and the strength of the community. The oldest recorded sumo match in Japanese history appears in the Nihon Shoki, the Chronicles of Japan, compiled in 720 CE, though the practice is likely older than any written record. The rules of sumo are simple and ancient. Two wrestlers face each other in the round ring, the dohyo, a circle of clay bounded by a rope of rice straw, and the match is decided by the first wrestler to touch the ground outside the ring with any part of the body other than the soles of the feet. No striking, no choking, just two bodies in contact, each trying to move the other out of the circle. The simplicity of this is part of what gives sumo its particular gravity, the sense that what is being tested here is not technique alone, but something more fundamental, the physical reality of one person against another, without the additional variables of weapons or strategies that most conflict involves. Kintaro sumos with the bear. The bear is not a trained sumo partner. The bear is simply a bear, large, strong, with its own center of gravity and its own way of applying force. To wrestle a bear and sometimes win is to have tested yourself against something that has not agreed to follow human rules, that brings its own body and its own considerable strength to the encounter, and to have found that you are, in fact, strong enough. This is the test that matters, not the test against other people, not the competition in the ring with a human opponent, but the test against the mountain itself, in the form of the bear that the mountain produced. One morning, Kintaro set out into the mountain with his companions. The day was the kind of day that the mountains of Japan produce in early spring, the particular quality of morning light that comes when the worst of winter is over, and the world is beginning to remember what warmth is, thin and clear, with a brightness to it that has not yet become the full brightness of summer, but is pointing in that direction. They came to a gorge. Below them, the water ran fast, the snowmelt of the high peaks coming down through the valley with the energy of water that has been accumulating all winter and is now released in the particular force of spring, too fast to cross on foot, too wide to jump. Between them and the other side, the rushing water and no bridge. The bear tried to push a tree across, a large tree, old cedar, its trunk thick and rough-barked, standing at the edge of the gorge. The bear placed its weight against the trunk and pushed. The tree moved slightly. The leaves rustled. The bear pushed harder. The tree did not fall. Kintaro stepped forward. He was a child. In years, certainly, in the bib he wore, in the sense that his mother was still somewhere on the mountain waiting for him to come home, but a child of a particular kind, a child in whom the force available was not a child's force, but something that the mountain had given him through the years of growing up on it, through the wrestling with bears and the carrying of the masakari and the daily work of the mountain life. He put his hands against the tree. He pushed. The tree bent. The roots came up. With a sound like the mountain rearranging itself, the tree came down across the gorge, reaching from one side to the other, Resting on the rock edges, a bridge. The animals crossed. Kintaro crossed last. Below them, the water rushed on, entirely unimpressed. The mountain moves through seasons. This is obvious. All mountains move through seasons. But the particular way that the Ashigara Mountains move through them is worth attending to, because it is the rhythm that organized Kintaro's life from the beginning. Spring on Ashigara comes late, later than in the valleys below, where the plum blossoms open in February and the cherry follows, and the rice fields begin to show green by April. The mountain holds the cold a little longer, keeps the snow on the high slopes into March and sometimes April, keeps the forest in its winter state, bare deciduous trees, dark conifers, the brown of last year's leaves still on the ground, while the world below has already moved into the next season. And then, when spring comes, it comes completely. The new growth appears, the particular fresh green of spring leaves, lighter and brighter than the deep green of summer, the color of something that is new to the world and has not yet been weathered, and the mountain changes in a matter of days, from the dark tones of winter to the soft, luminous green of early spring. Autumn is the mountain's most visible season. The deciduous trees of Ashigara, the maple and the oak and the beech, turn in October, and the mountain becomes a composition of red and gold and orange against the dark green of the cedar, a combination that the Japanese have always found beautiful and have built an aesthetic tradition around. The momiji, the autumn leaves, the particular beauty of things at the end of their cycle, expressing themselves fully before they release. Kintaro would have known this, known the way the mountain looked in those October weeks when the colors were at their peak, and the beauty of it would have been simply part of the world as he knew it, not something to go see, not a destination, but the place he lived in, being what it always was at this time of year. Winter came with snow. The higher slopes covered first, then the forest, then even the lower areas where Kintaro and his mother lived. And the mountain became a different place, quieter, more self-contained, the tracks of the animals visible in the snow in a way they were not at other times of year. The bear tracks, the deer tracks, the small, careful prints of the fox. Kintaro could read these tracks, knew who had passed and how recently and where they were going, in the way of someone who lives in a landscape long enough to learn its second language, the language of signs and marks that tells you what has been here, even when what has been here is gone. Water comes off the mountain. This is the fundamental fact of mountain landscapes everywhere, that the rain and the snow that fall on the high slopes must go somewhere, must find their way down through the rock and the soil and the roots of the trees, and eventually out into the streams that run along the valley floors, and eventually into the rivers, and eventually into the sea. The water of Ashigara is the water of Fuji, the great mountain to the west, whose presence you feel even when it is hidden by cloud, whose shape appears on clear days above the ridge line, stores the winter snowfall in its deep rock, and releases it slowly over months and years through the springs that emerge in the valleys around it. The water of the springs near Ashigara is the water that fell as snow on Fuji's slopes, perhaps decades earlier, stored in the cold dark of the volcanic rock and released now, cold and clear, into the forest streams that Kintaro knew as a child. He would drink from these streams directly, the cold water cupped in both hands or drunk from the surface while lying on the bank, in the way of people who are completely at home in a place and have no hesitation about what it offers. The water is clean. The mountain has filtered it. You drink and it is cold in a way that the cold of the mountain is always cold, not the cold of ice, but the cold of depth, of something that has been underground a long time and carries in it the temperature of the interior of the earth. The gorge that Kintaro bridged with the tree was carved by this water, by years and centuries of the same water finding the same path and wearing the rock away with the patient force of something that has nowhere else to go and nothing but time. The gorge is the mountain's autobiography, the record of everything the water has done since the mountain first rose and the water first ran. Kintaro fell the tree across it in a moment. The gorge took 1,000 years. Both are real. Both belong to the mountain. The moment and the 1,000 years are not different in kind, are both expressions of the same basic fact of the mountain, that things happen here, slowly and quickly, and the mountain holds them all. There was a man on the mountain that day, a samurai, Minamoto no Yorimitsu, one of the great warriors of the mid-Heian period, traveling through the Ashigara Pass with his attendants on the road between the eastern provinces and the capital. He heard the sound of the tree falling. He moved toward it, and he saw a boy, red-bibbed and large, standing on the far side of the gorge beside a fallen cedar that he had apparently just pushed across the gap. Yorimitsu watched for a moment. He was a man who knew strength, who had spent his life in its company and its service, and he understood immediately that what he was looking at was unusual, not just strong, not just the brute force of a large, healthy child, but strength with a quality to it, the kind of strength that comes from a life spent in genuine engagement with the physical world, that has been tested and confirmed in the particular way of things tested by reality rather than by performance. He approached Kintaro. He asked, "Who are you? Where do you come from? Who is your family?" Kintaro told him about Yaigiri, about the mountain, about the years of living on Ashigara with the bears and the deer and the others. Yorimitsu listened. Then he said, "Come with me to the capital. I will give you a name and a place in my service. You have the strength and the quality to be a great warrior." Kintaro was quiet for a moment. He looked at the mountain, at the cedar forests, and the gorge, and the animals that had gathered at a respectful distance and were watching. He looked at the samurai. Then he said, "I will go." The animals watched him go with the particular stillness of creatures who know that something is ending, that the world they have shared with this particular presence will be different after this than it was before. Minamoto no Yorimitsu, known also as Raiko, was one of the great samurai of the mid-Heian period, the period in Japanese history between approximately 794 and 1185, when the imperial court in Kyoto was the center of cultural and political life, and the warrior class was beginning to accumulate the power and the identity that would make it the dominant force in Japan for the following 7 centuries. The Heian period is famous for its culture, for the poetry and the diaries and the novels produced at and around the imperial court, for the particular aesthetic refinement that reached its highest expression in works like The Tale of Genji, but it was also a period of real political struggle, of powerful clans competing for influence and territory, of warriors like Yorimitsu, who existed at the boundary between the cultured world of the court and the more violent world of the provinces. Yorimitsu is famous in part for the stories of the supernatural encounters of his band of warriors, stories involving demons and monsters, and the various strange creatures that the Japanese imagination populated the wild places with. His four most celebrated warriors, the Shitenno, the four heavenly kings, were famous for their encounters with the Oni of O Mountain, the great demon Shuten Doji, who terrorized the capital and was defeated by Yorimitsu's band through a combination of strength and cunning, and the particular courage of people who go toward, rather than away from what frightens them. Kintaro, who became Sakata Kintoki, one of the four, was the strongest of these warriors, not the cleverest, not the most strategically minded, but the one in whom strength was most completely realized, the one who, when force was required, provided it in its clearest form. He carried with him into the warrior world something of Ashigara, the directness of the mountain, the simplicity of a life in which problems were physical and solutions were physical, and the question of what to do was answered by doing it. The evening before he left, Kintaro sat with his mother at the edge of the house, on the step that looked out over the slope below, where the forest began and the mountain descended into the valley. The light was the light of late afternoon, the particular golden light of a clear day moving toward its end, the light that makes everything it touches look more itself than it usually does, that picks out the texture of the cedar bark and the color of the moss, and the particular silver gray of old weathered wood with a precision that the harsher light of midday does not have. Yaegiri did not try to dissuade him. She had raised a son who was not hers to keep, who had always been, in some sense, more of the mountain than of the house, and she understood that the meeting with Yorimitsu was not an accident, but something that was always going to happen, the moment when the mountain returned what it had produced to the larger world. She made him food for the journey, not the elaborate preparation of someone who is trying to delay the leaving by extending the preparations, but the practical provision of a mother who wants her child to travel well: rice, dried fish, the things that keep and sustain on a long walk to the capital. The bear was somewhere nearby, audible perhaps in the forest below, the particular sound of a large animal moving through undergrowth, but not visible, as if it already knew something was ending and had made its decision about how to receive that knowledge. Quietly, in the forest, at a distance. The next morning, Kintaro rose early. He picked up the masakari, then set it down. He would not need it where he was going. He bowed to his mother. He bowed to the mountain. Then he walked down the slope into the valley and the road and the rest of his life. The bear. In Japan, the bear occupies a particular place in the relationship between the human world and the natural one, a relationship that is, in Japan, more carefully maintained and more consciously considered than in most other parts of the world. Two species of bear live in Japan. The Asian black bear, called Tsuki no Waguma, the moon ring bear, named for the pale crescent shape on its chest, lives throughout the forests of Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, in the mountains and the hills, in the old forests that cover the steep slopes of the interior. It is a medium-sized bear, smaller than the grizzly, smaller than the brown bear of Hokkaido, but large enough to be a genuine presence in the forest, to be something that the people who live in mountain communities are aware of and respectful of, in the particular way of people who share territory with something larger and more powerful than themselves. The brown bear of Hokkaido, the higuma, is a different creature. Larger, more powerful, with the particular intensity of a bear that has evolved in a landscape with more salmon and more space than the forested mountains of the main island. In Ainu culture, the indigenous culture of Hokkaido, the bear is not simply an animal, but a deity, a kamui, a spiritual being that visits the human world in the form of a bear and must be received with the appropriate ceremony and returned to the spirit world with appropriate gratitude. Kintaro's bear is neither of these exactly, is the bear of the folk tale, which carries in it elements of the actual bear and elements of the symbolic bear, the bear that represents the wild, physical, unhuman quality of the mountain itself. To ride a bear, to be at ease with a bear, to wrestle with a bear and sometimes win, is to have made peace with the mountain on its own terms, to have become something that belongs here in a way that the ordinary human does not. This is what Kintaro is, a creature of the mountain in human form, belonging here as completely as the cedar trees and the spring water and the bears themselves. The masakari, the broad-bladed axe that Kintaro carries in every image, every story, every representation, the axe over his shoulder, the axe that is as much a part of him as the red of his bib or the roundness of his face, is not simply a weapon. The masakari is a woodcutter's tool, not the small axe of the household, not the hatchet for splitting kindling, but the large axe of the mountain worker, the person who cuts timber in the forests of the high slopes, who brings down the trees that build the houses and fuel the fires of the people in the valleys below. It is a tool of the mountain, specifically of the mountain, not of the village or the farm, and the person who carries it is identified by its weight as someone who belongs to the mountain in the particular way of the person who works there, who knows it not as a view, but as a workplace. Kintaro carries the masakari not as a weapon of war, but as the tool of his life, the tool he uses to do what needs to be done in the place where he lives. He is not a warrior yet. The warrior comes later, when Yorimitsu names him and takes him to the capital, and the life of the mountain becomes the life of the court and the battlefield. But in the years on Ashigara, in the years that the story most lingers over, the years of the bear and the deer and the summer forests and the spring snowmelt, the masakari is just what he carries because it is useful and because the mountain requires it. There is something appealing about this. The great warrior begins not with a sword, not with the elegant, refined weapon of the samurai tradition, but with the workman's axe. He begins with work, with the practical demands of the practical life, and the strength that the axe cultivated, the years of its weight on his shoulder, the work of the forest, is the same strength that served him later in the capital, when the work was different, but the need for strength was the same. Ashigara, the mountain where Kintaro grew up, is not a single peak, but a range, the Ashigara Mountains, running along the border between what are now Kanagawa and Shizuoka prefectures, in the part of Japan where the great mountain of Fuji rises above everything else, and makes even substantial peaks seem smaller by comparison. The highest point of the Ashigara range is called Kintoki Yama, Kintoki Mountain, named for the warrior that Kintaro eventually became. This renaming, the mountain taking the name of the person whose legend grew up around it, is one of the ways that landscapes and legends make each other permanent. The story gives the mountain a name. The mountain keeps the story alive. The ancient road that crossed these mountains, the Ashigara Pass, was one of the important routes in old Japan, the path that travelers took between the Kanto Plain and the provinces to the west before the coastal road became the more common route. Minamoto no Yorimitsu was traveling this road when he encountered Kintaro, was crossing the pass on his way between the warrior country of the east and the cultural capital of Kyoto, and the encounter happened at the particular place where the road was steepest, where the mountain made itself felt most, where the traveler was most completely in the mountain's world rather than the road's. The mountain today is a hiking destination. The slopes of Kintoki Yama are walked by thousands of people every year, people who come from Tokyo and Yokohama for the trails and the views and the particular quality of being above the city for a few hours. On clear days, Fuji is visible from the summit, close and enormous, the cone so perfect it seems almost not to be a real mountain, but a representation of one. Below, the Kanto Plain stretches all the way to the horizon, and somewhere in the middle distance is the city that Kintaro eventually went to, following the samurai and leaving the bear to watch from the edge of the forest. How did Kintaro become a legend? The process is one that repeated itself many times in the history of Japanese folk tradition. A real person, or the memory of a real person, accumulated layers of story over the centuries until the person and the story became indistinguishable. The historical figure at the center of the Kintaro legend is Sakata Kintoki, a warrior in the service of Minamoto no Yorimitsu in the late 10th century. Whether this warrior actually grew up on a mountain and wrestled bears is not something the historical record confirms. The earliest documents, the Kanjaku Monogatari, the tales of times now past, compiled in the early 12th century, describe a young man encountered by Yorimitsu in the mountains, born of a woman who had been visited in a dream by a red dragon, recruited into Yorimitsu's service because of his unusual strength, the bear wrestling, the red bib, the masakari, the animal companions. These details accumulated later in the folk tellings, in the Jaruri puppet theater, and the kabuki plays of the Edo period, as the story was told and retold, and each telling added what the listeners found most vivid. By the time the story reached its current form, the form that Meiji-era school books and 20th century picture books passed on to every generation of Japanese children, it had become what all enduring legends become, more true than the facts, not factually accurate, not the verified record of what actually happened on the slopes of Ashigara in the 10th century, but true in the deeper sense, true to what people believe is possible, what they value, what kind of childhood they would wish for a future warrior. Strength from nature, friendship with animals, a mother who raised a son alone and did it well, a meeting with a great man at the right moment. These things feel true, feel like the shape that a meaningful life should have. Whether or not they happened exactly this way, for exactly this person, in exactly this place. The mountain kept the story kept the mountain, and both are still here. What does the mountain give? This is not a rhetorical question, not a question that is asked in order to be left unanswered, but a genuine inquiry into what the Kintaro story is actually about. The mountain gives strength. This is the obvious gift, the physical strength that the mountain life produces, the body that develops in response to the demands of the mountain, the carrying and the climbing and the working in the cold, the years of effort that accumulate in the muscles and the bones, and the particular quality of physical capability that comes from having been tested repeatedly and genuinely. The mountain gives independence. Kintaro grew up without the structures of the village life below, without the hierarchy of the community, the expectations of neighbors, the constant social calibration of a person who lives among many people and must navigate their opinions and their judgments. He had his mother, he had the mountain, he had the animals. This is a spare set of relationships, fewer than most people have, fewer than most people would choose, but it produced in him a quality of self-reliance that the more crowded life below does not easily produce. The ability to be alone without being lonely, to work without being watched, to know what you are capable of, not because others have told you, but because you have found out yourself. The mountain gives a particular kind of knowing, not the knowing of books, not the knowing of study or of the accumulated wisdom of teachers, but the knowing of the body in a particular place over a long time, the knowledge of where the water runs and where the deer sleep and where the bear goes when the snow comes, the knowledge that is not transferable, that cannot be written down or taught in a classroom, that belongs to the person who earned it by being in the place long enough to learn it. This is what Kintaro carried with him when he left, carried into the city and the warrior life and the service of the great samurai. Not just the strength of his body, but the particular quality of knowing that the mountain had given him. The knowing of a person who is not surprised by difficulty, who has already met the bear and found out what they are capable of, who understands that strength is not something you declare, but something you discover. On the mountain, in the forest, in the cold water of the morning, in the particular quality of a life lived close to what is real. What is Kintaro about? The obvious answer is strength. The story is about a strong boy who becomes a strong warrior, and this is not wrong, but the kind of strength the story celebrates is not simply the strength of the fighter, not the strength that imposes itself on others, but a particular kind of strength, strength that is at ease with itself. Kintaro does not use his strength aggressively. He does not go looking for things to overcome. He wrestles with the bear because the bear is a worthy partner, because genuine strength requires genuine testing, and the testing is mutual, a pleasure for both parties rather than a dominance exercised by one. He falls the tree because the tree is needed for a bridge, because there is a practical problem and he has the means to solve it, not to demonstrate anything, not to impress anyone, but simply because he can and because it needs to be done. This is a particular Japanese ideal, the strength that is not separate from kindness, the power that does not require the diminishment of what is around it in order to express itself. The animals come to Kintaro willingly. The bear allows itself to be ridden. The deer and the monkey and the rabbit follow him through the forest. These are not creatures that have been defeated or domesticated. They are creatures that have recognized something in this boy, something that is not a threat, something that is of the mountain the way they are of the mountain, and have chosen to be in his company. Let it all soften now. The Ashigara forests in early spring, the light through the cedar, the sound of the snow melt in the streams below, the boy on the bear, the axe on his shoulder, the red of his bib against the green of the forest, the tree falling across the gorge, the animals crossing, the samurai watching from the ridge, and the moment of leaving, the mountain behind him, the capital ahead, the bear somewhere in the forest watching him go. Tonight, let your own strength rest, not the physical strength, though that can rest too, but the effort of the day, the pushing and the carrying and the solving of problems that require more than you had thought you had. It has been enough. You have been enough. The mountain is here, always here, holding everything, and you are warm and still and exactly where you should be. Rest well, sleep well. Good night. New Japanese stories every day on Quiet Tales of Japan. See you again for your next sleep. Warashibbe Choja, the Straw Millionaire, a Japanese folk tale for sleep. Close your eyes if you'd like, or simply let your gaze go soft, resting on nothing in particular. Let your body settle wherever you are. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest open and still. There is nothing you need to do right now, nothing to hold on to. For the next little while, you are simply here, listening and resting. Tonight, we are going somewhere warm and unhurried, somewhere in the Japanese countryside, in the kind of place where the rice fields stretch wide and flat beneath an open sky, and the roads between the villages are long and dusty, and the world moves at the pace of things that grow rather than the pace of things that are built. It is a place where a journey can begin with almost nothing, with a single piece of straw picked up from the ground without thinking, held loosely in one hand, as a young man walks out into the world, not quite knowing where he is going or what will come of it. This is a story about that young man. It is a quiet story, a slow one, the kind where nothing is forced and everything arrives in its own time, carried along by the simple current of one honest exchange after another. Breathe in slowly and let it out. Let the day go. There is nowhere else to be. There are people in every village and every town and every part of Japan who are known for their good nature, the way other people are known for their skill with a particular craft or their knowledge of a particular subject, known for it the way the landscape is known for a particular feature, a particular hill, or a particular bend in the river, something that is simply there and has always been there and is part of what the place is. The young man in this story was known in that way. He was known for his willingness, for the quality of attention he brought to whatever was in front of him, for the absence in him of the calculation and guardedness that many people develop as they make their way through a world that does not always treat them well. He was not naive. He had lived long enough and worked hard enough to understand that the world was not arranged for his convenience, and that things did not generally come easily. But he had not let that understanding harden into bitterness or close him off from what was around him, and that quality, that openness, that willingness to be present to whatever the day offered, was the thing that people noticed about him and remembered. He had no family left to speak of. His parents were gone, and he had no brothers or sisters, and the relatives who remained were distant enough in both blood and geography that they had little to do with his life. He had no land of his own, no house, no trade that could feed him reliably through the changing of the seasons. He worked where work was available, in the rice fields at planting time and harvest time, in the forests cutting wood when the season permitted, carrying loads and mending things and doing whatever needed doing for whoever needed it done. It was not a bad life, exactly, but it was a life without much purchase, without the feeling of solidity and continuance that comes from having a place that is yours, and a work that is yours, and a future that you can see the shape of, even if you cannot see its details. And on the morning that this story begins, the young man had walked a long distance, with not much money, and not much food, and not much sense of where he was going, and he was tired in the way that people get tired, not just from walking, but from the accumulated weight of not quite knowing what their life is for. His feet carried him in the way that feet sometimes carry people when the mind has stopped directing them to a temple on the edge of a small town. It was not a grand temple, not one of the great complexes of halls and gates and pagodas that stand in the famous places and draw visitors from far away. It was the kind of temple that exists in every part of Japan, modest and local, its buildings weathered by many seasons, its courtyard swept clean by the monk or caretaker whose daily task that was, its air holding the particular quality of temple air that is different from the air outside, stiller, somehow, as if the space inside the walls had agreed to move at a different pace from the space outside them. The main hall of the temple housed a statue of Kannon, the bodhisattva of compassion, the figure to whom people bring the things they cannot bring anywhere else, the griefs and the worries and the hopes that are too large or too formless to be addressed to any ordinary person. Kannon is depicted in many forms in Japan, sometimes standing, sometimes seated, sometimes with many arms that reach in all directions simultaneously, as if to indicate that compassion has no limit on the directions in which it can extend. This particular Kannon was seated, of medium size, its expression the expression of someone who has heard everything and is not troubled by any of it, and is still listening. The young man climbed the worn stone steps and stood before the hall and pressed his hands together and bowed his head. He did not have an elaborate prayer prepared. He was not a particularly religious person in the formal sense. He did not observe all the rituals or know all the sutras or participate in all the ceremonies that a more devout person would have participated in, but he was sincere, and sincerity is what temples of this kind ask for. He asked simply for some guidance, some indication of which direction to go, some small sign that the world was paying attention. He stayed there a long time, head bowed, hands pressed together, while the sounds of the town continued on the other side of the temple wall. The voices of people going about their mourning, the sound of a cart on a stone road, the cry of a bird somewhere above the rooftops, and the courtyard remained still. And then, in the way that answers sometimes come, not as a voice or a vision or anything that could be pointed to and described precisely, but as a kind of settling, a quieting of something that had been restless, a sense of knowing, arriving from somewhere beneath the level of ordinary thought. The young man understood that he should take whatever he first touched upon leaving the temple and carry it with him and let it lead him where it would. It was not a complicated instruction. It was not a promise of wealth or success or any particular outcome. It was simply, take what comes first to your hand and trust it. He rose slowly. He turned and walked back across the courtyard and down the worn stone steps toward the gate. And on the last step, his foot caught the edge of the stone, and he stumbled forward, his hands going out automatically to catch himself, and his fingers closed around something lying in the dust at the base of the steps. He looked down. It was a single piece of straw, one of the stalks of dried rice straw that were everywhere in this part of Japan, blown from the fields after the harvest, carried by the wind into corners and against walls and onto the roads, so common as to be essentially invisible, the kind of thing a person steps over without registering. He stayed crouched there for a moment, looking at it in his hand. A single piece of straw, dry and pale and slightly bent, about the length of his hand from wrist to fingertip, not remarkable in any way that a piece of straw can be remarkable. He thought about this for a moment. He could have felt disappointed. He could have told himself that the instruction had been his imagination, and the stumble an ordinary stumble, and the straw an ordinary piece of straw, and none of it meant anything. But he didn't. He smiled instead, a small, quiet smile, the kind that is more like a decision than an expression, and he tucked the straw carefully into his hand, and stood up and walked out through the temple gate and onto the road. The road outside the temple ran south through the town, and then out into the countryside, where the buildings thinned and gave way to the rice fields that were the main fact of the landscape in this part of Japan. The fields in this season, late spring, the planting recently done, were filled with young rice plants standing in shallow water, their green vivid against the brown of the earth below, the whole landscape flooded and reflective, the sky doubled in the water between the rows. The road ran along the edge of this landscape on a raised embankment, wide enough for a cart, with the fields on either side and the mountains visible in the distance on clear days, and obscured by haze on days like this one, present but unspecific, shapes rather than details. The young man walked slowly, the piece of straw held loosely between his fingers. He was not in a hurry. He had nowhere specific to be and nothing specific to do, and for the moment that felt less like poverty and more like freedom, the freedom of a person who has let go of one thing and has not yet picked up another, who is in the interval between, which is uncomfortable in some ways and spacious in others. He looked at the fields as he walked. He noticed the way the light moved on the water between the rice plants, the small movements of insects above the surface, the distant figure of another farmer working at the far edge of a field, bent at the waist in the posture of someone doing the slow, patient work of tending something that grows. He noticed the smell of the fields, the particular smell of flooded rice paddies in warm weather, which is the smell of water and earth and something living, a rich, slightly vegetal smell that is not unpleasant, and that is one of the essential smells of the Japanese countryside in the growing season, familiar to everyone who has ever lived near rice fields, and immediately recognizable to anyone who has grown up with it. He had not walked far when a horsefly appeared. It came from the direction of the fields. They bred in the wet margins of the paddies. These flies, large and purposeful, and possessed of the particular persistence that makes them, to the people and animals who share the summer landscape with them, one of the less welcome features of the season. This one circled the young man's head once, then again, with the unhurried confidence of something that has decided it is interested and sees no reason to hide the fact. The young man waved it away. It returned. He waved it away again, more deliberately. It circled out and came back, its low droning hum steady and untroubled, like the sound of something that has a great deal of patience and intends to use it. He watched it for a moment, the way it moved, the way it held its position in the air despite the movement of the air around it, the way its wings caught the light when it turned, and then, on an impulse he could not have explained, he reached out and caught it, not to kill it. He closed his fingers gently, carefully, just enough to hold it without harming it, feeling the small, strong vibration of its wings against his palm. He looked at it for a moment through the gap in his fingers. Then he took the piece of straw and, with the careful attention of someone doing a small, precise thing, tied one end of it loosely around the fly's leg. He held the other end of the straw and opened his hand. The fly lifted immediately, pulling against the straw, rising to the length of the tether and then circling, pulling, circling, the straw trailing from it like the string of a very small kite, the fly's hum taking on a slightly indignant quality, as if it understood that something had changed in its situation and was not entirely pleased about it. The young man laughed, a short, surprise sound, the kind of laugh that happens before you have decided whether something is funny. He kept walking, the straw trailing out from his fingers, the fly pulling at the end of it. After a while, the road passed through a small settlement, not quite a village, just a cluster of houses and a well and a rest area, where travelers could stop and sit in the shade of a large zelkova tree, whose roots had lifted the stones of the road around it, in the patient way that large old trees lift the things that were laid around them before anyone understood how large they would become. At the rest area, there was a family, a man and a woman and a young child, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, with a small cart that held their belongings. They had the look of people who had been traveling for some time and had stopped not entirely by choice. The cart had a wheel sitting at a slightly wrong angle, and the man was crouched beside it with the focused expression of someone trying to determine whether a problem is serious or merely inconvenient. The child was in the cart, and the child was crying, not the sharp, urgent crying of pain or fear, but the heavy, persistent crying of a child who is tired and hot and has been in a cart for too long and has run out of patience with the whole situation. The young man slowed. He watched the child for a moment. Then he held out his hand and let the horsefly on its straw tether drift forward in the air, the fly circling in its small, patient orbit, the straw trailing, the whole arrangement catching what little breeze there was, and moving with it. The child went still. The crying stopped between one moment and the next, replaced by the complete focused silence of a very young child who has seen something that has claimed all of its attention. The child's eyes tracked the fly. A small hand reached out. The fly circled, and the child's face opened into the kind of joy that only very young children produce. Total, immediate, filling the whole face at once, nothing held back, no awareness of being watched. The woman looked up. She and the young man looked at each other for a moment over the child's head, and she said that her child had been crying since before the last town, and she had not been able to find anything that helped, and she asked, with the careful politeness of someone asking for more than feels entirely proper, whether he might be willing to part with his curious little toy. The young man held the tether out, without hesitation. She took it with both hands in a deep bow, and tied it carefully around her own wrist, so that the fly continued its orbit in front of the child, who watched it with an expression of complete satisfaction. Then she reached into the cart and brought out 3 mandarin oranges, mikan, the small sweet tangerines that in Japan are so thoroughly associated with winter warmth and rest, that the smell of them alone can conjure the feeling of sitting beside a low table with a warm blanket over your lap. They were ripe and slightly warm from sitting in the cart in the sun, and they smelled of the clean sweetness that mandarin skin has when it is pressed or broken. He thanked her. She thanked him. The child did not look up from the fly. He walked on, 3 oranges in his hands, the road continuing south through the fields. The 3 oranges were a different kind of thing to carry than a piece of straw. They had weight and substance and smell, and carrying them required a small amount of care. They were ripe enough that pressing them too hard would damage them, and the young man carried them in both hands for a while, then found a way to hold all 3 in the fold of his arm, so that his hands were free. He thought about eating one. The morning had been long, and he had not eaten much, and the oranges smelled good, and the day was warm, and it would have been entirely reasonable. But something, not a voice, not a prohibition, just a quiet sense of waiting, of these things being for something he had not yet arrived at, made him keep walking with the oranges still unpeeled. The road in the early afternoon passed through a stretch of country where the rice fields gave way briefly to drier land, slightly elevated, with groves of cedar and bamboo on the hillsides, and the occasional farmhouse set back from the road behind its windbreak of trees. It was quieter here than in the open fields. The trees absorbed the sounds from the road, and the wind moved in them with the particular sound of wind in bamboo, a dry, rattling whisper that is one of the most distinctly Japanese of sounds, heard in gardens and in temple grounds, and in the margins of the countryside wherever bamboo has been planted or has spread on its own. He came to a place where a woman was sitting at the edge of the road in the shade of a bamboo grove, beside a bundle of belongings that suggested she was traveling rather than simply resting. She was not well. Even from a distance he could see that, and the quality of the stillness she was sitting in, which was the stillness of someone who has stopped, not because they wanted to stop, but because stopping was required. As he approached, he could see that her face was pale, and that she was pressing one hand against her side, and that her breathing was careful in the way that breathing becomes careful when something hurts. An older woman, her companion, or perhaps her mother, was kneeling beside her, with the expression of someone who is trying very hard not to show how worried they are. The young man stopped. He asked if he could help. The older woman looked up and said that her companion had been unwell since early morning, and that the heat of the road had made it worse, and that what she needed most urgently was something with juice and sweetness. The young man held out all 3 oranges without deliberation. The older woman received them with both hands and bowed deeply, and peeled one immediately and offered the sections to the young woman one at a time, and the young woman ate them slowly, and the young man stood a little apart and waited and watched the quality of the sitting change slightly, a small easing visible even from where he stood. When the orange was finished, the older woman rose and went to the bundle of belongings and unwrapped the outer layer carefully and drew out a length of silk. It was pale, the color of unbleached paper, with a fine weave and a quiet sheen that shifted as she moved it. Silk in Japan has a long history of being the material of ceremony and significance, the silk that wraps the gifts given at important occasions, the silk of the formal kimono worn at the moments in a life that are worth marking, the silk that lines the lacquered boxes in which the important objects of a household are kept. This length of silk was not large, but it was fine, and the woman offered it with the gravity of someone offering something that mattered. He accepted it with both hands and a bow. He folded it carefully and tucked it inside his jacket, where it lay cool and smooth against the coarser fabric, and bowed once more and turned back to the road. The afternoon was long, and the road was quiet, and the young man walked at the unhurried pace of someone who has stopped trying to arrive somewhere and is simply moving through the world, paying attention to it. He noticed the way the light lay across the landscape in the middle of the afternoon, flat and golden, the kind of light that has given up the sharpness of morning and not yet taken on the warmth of evening, the kind of light that makes everything look exactly as it is, without drama or embellishment. He noticed the sound of water moving in the irrigation channels that ran alongside the road, the low, continuous murmur that had been accompanying him for most of the day, so constant that he had stopped hearing it and now heard it again, in the way you rehear things that have always been there. He noticed the smell of the road itself, the warm dust of the dry stretches, the cooler, damp smell of the places where water came close to the surface, the occasional sweetness of something flowering in the verge. The rice paddies in this part of the road had given way to wider fields, dryland fields where other crops grew, barley and soybeans in their rows, and there were farmhouses more frequently here, set closer to the road, with their storage buildings and their kitchen gardens behind their low walls. The paddies required flooding and so were laid out in relation to the water, wherever the water could be brought from the irrigation system, but the dry land fields could go anywhere the soil was good and the farmer could reach them. and so the landscape here had a different character, less regular, less repetitive, more varied in its shapes and its levels, a landscape that had been fitted around the specificities of the land rather than imposed upon it. He was passing a paddock at the edge of the road, a fenced area of rough grass where a few animals could be kept, when he heard a sound that was wrong. It was the sound of a large animal breathing with difficulty, slow and labored, each breath a visible effort, the kind of breathing that is working much harder than breathing should have to work. He stopped. He looked over the fence. A horse was lying on its side in the grass, a dark horse, well proportioned, with the long legs and the depth of chest that indicated good breeding, the kind of horse that in better circumstances would have been moving through the world with ease and confidence. It was lying very still except for the difficult movement of its ribs and its eyes. When the young man leaned over the fence to look, were open and glazed and very tired, with the particular quality of exhaustion that is close to something worse. A man came out from the shed at the far side of the paddock. He was a merchant of some kind. His clothing and his manner both suggested someone who moved between towns and dealt in goods, the kind of person who calculated value quickly and accurately and made decisions based on those calculations. He explained that the horse had collapsed that morning, that he had tried everything he knew to try, and that he needed to be in the next town before nightfall and could not wait any longer. He said this with the expression of a person who has made a decision they are not entirely comfortable with, and is explaining it more to himself than to the person he is talking to. He looked at the horse the way people look at things they are trying to detach themselves from. The young man looked at the horse for a long time. He thought about the silk inside his jacket, the fine pale silk that had been given to him with gravity and care, that was worth considerably more than a sick horse lying in a paddock that might not recover. He thought about the instruction he had received at the temple, which was not to calculate but to follow, not to protect what he had, but to let it lead him. He drew the silk from inside his jacket and held it out. He said he would take the horse and tend to it and see what could be done. The merchant looked at the silk. He looked at the young man. He looked at the horse. Then he took the silk with both hands and a short bow and walked away quickly in the direction of the road without looking back. The young man climbed the fence and crossed the paddock and sat down in the grass beside the horse. He did not try to lift it or move it or do anything that required it to exert itself. He simply sat beside it in the late afternoon light and kept it company in the way that it is possible to keep company with something large and suffering, not with words, which would mean nothing to a horse, and not with busy intervention, which would only add to the disturbance, but with presence, with the quiet, steady presence of another creature nearby, which animals can feel and which is not nothing. He found the water trough at the far edge of the paddock and brought water in his cupped hands again and again, kneeling beside the horse's head, offering it patiently. The horse drank slowly, without eagerness at first, but steadily, and the young man made the trip to the trough and back many times as the afternoon moved toward evening. He talked to the horse quietly as he worked, not saying anything in particular, just talking in the low, even tone that horses respond to, the tone that says, "I am here. I am not a threat. I am not going anywhere." As the sun dropped toward the hills to the west, the horse's breathing became easier. The glazed quality left its eyes, and it began to track the young man's movements with more attention. By the time the light had gone horizontal and golden, across the paddock the horse had lifted its head from the grass and held it up, which required effort but was clearly possible, and which was different from how things had been an hour before. By the time the first stars appeared, it had gathered itself and risen to its feet, slowly, with effort, one leg at a time, pausing between each effort to find its balance, and stood in the dimming paddock with its legs slightly spread and its head still low, but standing. The young man stood beside it and rested his hand on its neck and felt the warmth of it and the steadiness of its breathing, which was no longer labored but simply the breathing of a large animal at rest. The night came down over the paddock the way night comes down in the countryside, gradually, without announcement, the light diminishing by degrees until the sky was fully dark and the stars were fully out, and the fields around the paddock were shapes rather than details. The young man sat with his back against the fence post and looked at the stars for a while, and then let his eyes close. The horse stood nearby in the darkness, breathing steadily, and the night moved over them both, unhurried, and the whole dark countryside settled into its deep, familiar quiet. In the morning, the horse was well, not entirely well. It still moved with deliberateness, still held its head slightly lower than a horse holds its head when it is entirely comfortable, but well enough to walk, and well enough to follow the young man when he led it gently out through the paddock gate and onto the road. The young man did not ride it. He walked beside it, one hand resting occasionally on its neck, and the horse walked beside him in the way that a horse walks when it has decided to trust someone, close and attentive, its steps matching his without being asked. There had been rain in the night. The young man had slept through it, briefly woken by a sound of it on the shed roof, and then back asleep. And the world had the particular clarity that follows rain, everything washed and fresh and precise, the outlines of the mountains visible at the edges of the sky with an unusual sharpness, the colors of the fields and the verges vivid in the morning light. The road was damp and the dust was laid, and the grasses along the road were heavy with water and bent by it, and the air smelled of wet earth and whatever was flowering in the verges, and there were birds active and vocal in a way that birds are active and vocal in the morning after rain, as if the rain had refreshed something in them too. The young man walked slowly, the horse beside him, and felt, with a quietness that surprised him, that he was happy. Not the sharp, excited happiness of getting something you wanted, but the slower, steadier happiness of being in the right place in the right moment, of having done what needed to be done, and finding yourself, on the other side of it, in a world that seems slightly better than it did before. He had given away a piece of silk for a sick horse. The horse had recovered. He was walking down a beautiful road in the morning after rain, with a horse beside him that had decided to trust him, and the mountains were sharp against the sky, and there was nowhere he urgently needed to be. This was enough. This was, in fact, quite a lot. By midday, the road had brought him to the edge of a wide valley, broader than the ones he had been walking through, with a river visible in the distance, and the town that had grown up around the river visible as a cluster of rooftops, and the occasional taller structure, a warehouse, a temple pagoda, rising above them. The road here was wider and better maintained than the road he had been on, worn smooth by more traffic, with the verges kept clear, and the bridges over the irrigation channels solid and recently repaired. This was a prosperous part of the country. He could see it in the quality of the farmhouses, in the size of the fields, in the straightness and regularity of the irrigation system, all of which spoke of resources applied carefully over a long time to the improvement of the land. At the edge of the road, set back behind a wall of old stone and a row of large pine trees, whose age was visible in the breadth of their trunks and the complexity of their branching, there was an estate. The gate was open, and there was activity in the courtyard, servants moving with the organized busyness of people who have clear tasks and are doing them, things being carried and arranged, the sound of voices giving and receiving instructions. The buildings of the estate were substantial and well maintained, their roofs newly thatched in places, their walls freshly whitewashed, the garden visible through the gate complex and carefully tended, the kind of garden that takes decades to achieve and requires constant attention to sustain. A man came out through the gate as the young man approached, the master of the estate clearly, from the way the others in the courtyard oriented toward him without stopping their work, the way people orient toward a center of gravity without having to think about it. He was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with the weathered look of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, and his eyes went immediately and with obvious recognition to the horse walking beside the young man. He came out through the gate and walked around the horse slowly, looking at it with the attentiveness of someone who knows horses and is accustomed to evaluating them carefully before reaching a conclusion. He ran a hand along its flank. He looked at its legs. He stood in front of it and looked at its face, and the horse looked back at him with its dark, calm eyes. Then the man turned to the young man and asked where he was going. The young man said, honestly, that he did not entirely know. He said that he had set out from a temple some days ago with a piece of straw, and that one thing had led to another in the way that things sometimes do when you stop trying to direct them, and that the horse had come to him sick, and he had stayed with it through the night, and that here he was. He told this simply, without dramatizing it, and without diminishing it, the way you tell the plain account of something when you have stopped trying to make it sound like more or less than it is. The master of the estate listened carefully. He was quiet for a moment after the young man finished, looking at the horse, and then at the young man, and then at the horse again. Then he said that he recognized this horse, that it had been bred on this estate and sold some years ago when circumstances had required it, and that he had regretted the sale and had not expected to see the horse again. He said that he would like to have it back. He asked what the young man wanted in exchange. The young man thought about this. He thought about the straw and the fly and the oranges and the silk and the horse and the long road and the rain in the night and the sharp mountains in the morning and the steadiness of the horse walking beside him. He thought about how none of it had been planned, how each thing had simply presented itself, and he had responded to it, and how the responding had led, without his intending it, to this, to standing in front of an open gate with a recovered horse beside him, being asked what he wanted. He looked at the estate, the old pines, the well-made buildings, the garden visible through the gate, the sense of a place that had been cared for over a long time by people who valued it. He said that he did not need much, but if there was work to be done on the estate, he would do it well, and if there was somewhere he could sleep, he would ask for nothing more than that. He said this without false modesty, not performing humility, but genuinely meaning it, genuinely having arrived at a point where shelter and useful work seemed like exactly what he wanted. The master of the estate looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not a large smile, but a real one. The kind that comes from recognizing something you were hoping to find. He said that a person who had turned a piece of straw into a horse without deceiving or taking advantage of anyone along the way was a person he was glad to have arrived at his gate. He opened the gate wider and gestured toward the courtyard. The young man led the horse through the gate. A stable hand came immediately and took the horse by the bridle, and the horse went with him calmly, turning its head once to look back at the young man before it disappeared into the stable. The young man watched it go. He felt something at that. A small thing, not grief, not quite, but the particular feeling of a connection that has been made and then released, of having been trusted by something and then letting it go to where it belonged. A servant led him across the courtyard and through a low doorway and along a covered walkway to a room at the back of the main building, a room that looked out through a sliding screen onto a small interior garden. The garden was the kind of garden that Japanese rooms have looked onto for centuries. A few carefully placed stones, a small pine tree grown and shaped over many years into a particular balanced asymmetry, a patch of moss between the stones, a stone basin with water, not large, not spectacular, but composed, arranged with the understanding that a garden seen through a screen is a different thing from a garden walked through, that what is needed is something to rest the eye on, something that holds stillness without holding rigidity, that changes with the light and the season while remaining itself. A sleeping mat had been laid out on the clean wooden floor, and there was a small low table and a ceramic cup of water, and through the screen the garden was quiet and still in the late afternoon light. The young man sat down on the mat. He looked at the garden for a while. He looked at the small pine, which had been growing in this garden for longer than he had been alive, patiently becoming the shape it was, with no awareness of being looked at and no need for it. He looked at the stones, which had been in their positions for as long as the garden had existed, holding the particular quality of very old stones that have been chosen for their shape and placed with care, the quality of things that are exactly where they are supposed to be. He lay down slowly on the mat. He closed his eyes. Outside, the courtyard went quiet as the afternoon deepened, and the estate settled into its evening rhythm, and the garden held its stillness. He stayed. That is the simple version of what happened next, and it is accurate as far as it goes. He stayed, and the days became weeks, and the weeks became months, and the months accumulated into seasons, and the seasons into years. and he stayed through all of it. He worked on the estate as he had said he would, and he worked well, which he had also said he would, and neither of these things surprised anyone who came to know him. He learned the fields and the rhythms of the estate, the particular qualities of the soil in different parts of the land, the places where the water ran well and the places where it needed help, the timing of the work through the year, the planting and the tending and the harvesting and the preparation for the next year, the whole long circular logic of an agricultural estate that has been operating for generations and has refined its practices through all the accumulated experience of everyone who has worked it. He was good at learning, not in the way that is merely clever. He was not particularly clever, in the narrow sense of that word, but in the way that comes from genuine attention, from actually looking at what is in front of you and listening to what the people who know more than you are telling you, and being willing to be wrong and to try again without making a great event of it. The people who worked on the estate recognized this quality in him and were over time willing to teach him things they might not have taught someone who was merely present and merely competent, things they might only teach someone they trusted. And the master of the estate watched this and was satisfied in the particular way that a person is satisfied when they trusted their initial judgment of someone and have been proven right. There was a daughter of the household. She was a few years younger than the young man, and she had grown up on this estate in the way that people grow up in places they belong to, knowing it deeply and specifically, knowing the name of every tree in the garden, and the history of every building, and the stories attached to every corner of the land. She was not waiting for someone to arrive and change her life. Her life was full and specific, and she was engaged with it. But she noticed the young man in the way that people notice others who have the quality of genuine attention, and she found herself, over the months and then the years, seeking out occasions to speak with him, and finding that the speaking was easy in the way that it is easy with people whose company agrees with you without your being able to say exactly why. They married in the end in the way that things happen in this story, without drama, without sudden revelation, without a moment where everything changed at once. There was a conversation, and then another, and then a ceremony in the garden on a morning in late spring, with the old pine tree standing as it had always stood, and the stones in their places, and the moss between them, the particular deep green that moss is in spring, and the people of the estate gathered in the courtyard, and the day was ordinary and extraordinary in the way that the important days of a life are both of those things simultaneously. And in time, as the master of the estate grew older, and the young man, who was no longer quite so young, grew more capable and more trusted and more deeply rooted in the place, the estate passed to him, not in a single moment, not as a transaction, but gradually, the way responsibility passes, when it passes honestly, through the accumulation of demonstrated care, through the slow transfer of knowledge, through the recognition on both sides that the place had found the person it needed. And sometimes, in the evenings, when the work of the day was finished and the estate had settled into its evening quiet, and the light had gone low and golden over the garden, He would sit on the edge of the covered walkway with his feet on the stepping stone below and look at the small pine and the old stones and the moss between them, and he would hold in his mind, lightly and without effort, the image of a piece of straw, dry and pale and slightly bent, lying in the dust at the base of a temple step, the kind of thing a person steps over without registering. He had picked it up. That was all. He had picked it up because he had been told to take the first thing that came to his hand, and it had come to his hand, and he had picked it up and held it and let it lead him. And somewhere along the long road that followed, through the fly and the child and the oranges and the silk and the horse and the morning after rain and the sharp mountains and the open gate, his life had become this garden, this place, this person beside him in the evenings, this work that was his, this land that knew him, this particular arrangement of stones and moss and pine that he had been looking at long enough now that it had become part of how he understood himself to be in the world. He had not planned any of it. He had not been clever about it or strategic or calculating. He had simply paid attention and responded honestly to what presented itself, and what had presented itself, in response to that honesty, was a life, a full one, a life that fit him the way a tool fits a hand that has used it long enough, not because the fit was perfect from the beginning, but because the use itself had made the fit, the daily contact between the person and the work and the place, shaping all three of them gradually into something that went together. He sat in the garden in the evening light and breathed slowly and felt, without needing to name it, the thing that is the opposite of the weariness he had felt on the road on the morning this story began, the thing that is not the absence of effort, but the presence of rightness, the sense of being exactly where you are supposed to be and knowing it. Let it all soften now, the long dusty road and the flooded rice fields reflecting the sky, the temple courtyard and the piece of straw in the dust, the fly on its tether and the child's face opening into joy, the sick horse breathing in the paddock and the night coming down over the countryside, the morning after rain and the sharp mountains and the open gate. Let it dissolve gently, the way the mist dissolves over the rice fields in the morning when the sun has been up long enough, burning off quietly, without drama, leaving the landscape clear. There is nothing left to hold tonight, nothing to figure out, nothing to carry. You are warm, and you are still, and you are exactly where you should be. The road is quiet. The fields are at rest. The garden holds its stillness in the evening light. Let your breathing slow. Let the quiet take you. Let the day go completely, the way the young man let each thing go when the time came, without grasping, without regret, with the trust that what comes next will be what it needs to be. Rest well. Sleep well. Good night. Urashima Taro, a Japanese folk tale for sleep. Close your eyes if you'd like, or simply let your gaze go soft, resting on nothing in particular. Let your body settle wherever you are. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest open and still. There is nothing you need to do right now, nothing to hold on to. For the next little while, you are simply here, listening and resting. Tonight, we are going somewhere very far away, down through the surface of the sea, past the place where the light changes color, past the place where the water grows cold and dark, down to a place that exists in the oldest layer of the Japanese imagination, a place where time moves differently, where beauty is permanent, where the seasons exist all at once, and the world above is very far away and very small. This is the story of Urashima Taro, one of the oldest and most loved tales in Japan, a story that has been told for more than 1,000 years, appearing in the ancient chronicles and the poetry collections of the 8th century before it settled into the form that has been passed down to every Japanese child ever since. It is a story about kindness and its unexpected rewards, about the strangeness of time, about the particular sorrow of returning to find that the world has moved on without you. But tonight, we will live inside it slowly. We will feel the cool water of the sea. We will hear the sound of the waves. We will walk through the 4 seasons in a single room, and we will sit beside the young fisherman as he watches the world. He new becomes something he no longer recognizes. Breathe in slowly and let it out. Let the day go. There is nowhere else to be. There was once a young fisherman who lived at the edge of the sea. His name was Urashima Taro, and he was the kind of person who is remembered not for anything grand. He did, but for the quality he brought to ordinary things, the patience with which he worked, the gentleness with which he moved through the world, the particular way he had of paying attention to what was in front of him and responding to it honestly, without calculation. He lived with his mother in a small house near the water. The house was not much to speak of, a low structure of old wood and tile, its walls dark with years of smoke from the cooking fire, its garden small and carefully tended, the kind of garden that a person makes when they do not have much space, but want to bring the world into what space they have. Outside the garden wall, the sea began. Not gradually, not with a long beach and rolling dunes that give you time to prepare yourself, but almost immediately, the way the sea begins in some parts of Japan, where the mountains come down close to the coast, and the water starts where the land ends, without apology. He had grown up with the sound of it, the particular sound of this sea, the particular pitch and rhythm of these waves on this shore at this time of year, was as familiar to him as the sound of his own breathing, something he had stopped noticing, the way you stop noticing the sounds of the place you have always lived and only become aware of them again when you are away for a while and then return. He fished every day, out in the early morning, before the light had fully arrived, when the sea had the quality of something that is not yet decided what color it will be, and back in the late afternoon with whatever the sea had given him that day, sometimes much, sometimes little, always enough to feed himself and his mother with the small amount left over to trade for the other things a household needs. He was not unhappy. This is worth saying clearly because the story of Urashima Taro is sometimes told as if he were a man searching for something that his ordinary life could not provide, as if the adventure that came to him was a response to a dissatisfaction that had been building in him without his knowing. But that is not quite right. He was content in the particular way of people who have found a life that fits them, that asks of them what they are able to give and gives back to them what they need. He was simply a young man at the edge of the sea, doing the work of his life, paying attention to what was in front of him, living the days as they came. One afternoon he was walking along the shore when he came upon a group of children. They were clustered around something on the sand, bent over it, poking at it, with the absorbed and slightly cruel attention that children sometimes bring to small creatures they have found and do not yet know what to do with. He came closer. On the sand between them was a sea turtle, not large, not small, the size of something that had been alive for a few years and was still young enough to be vulnerable, still young enough that its shell had not yet reached the thickness and hardness of a fully grown animal. It was alive. Its eyes were open, tracking the children's movements with the patient endurance of something that cannot leave and has decided to wait. He did not lecture the children. He did not make a scene of it, did not point to the turtle and explain why they should not do what they were doing. He simply asked them, in the way that a person asks when they are genuinely curious rather than accusatory, what they were doing. The children, startled by the adult presence, gave the kinds of answers children give: uncertain, partial, trailing off. He listened. Then he reached into his pocket and brought out a few coins. Not many, not a grand gesture, just enough to be interesting to a group of children whose attention could be redirected by something more immediately appealing than a turtle on the sand. He held out the coins. The children looked at the coins, then at the turtle, then at the coins. The calculation did not take long. When they had gone, he crouched beside the turtle and looked at it for a moment. Its eyes looked back at him, dark and calm and very old, the eyes of a creature whose relationship to time is different from the human relationship to time, who lives in a slower rhythm, who has been doing this for longer than memory. He reached out and picked it up gently, feeling its weight, the smoothness of its shell, the small movements of its legs against his palms, and carried it to the edge of the water. He set it down where the waves could reach it. The turtle paused for a moment at the edge of the sea, as if orienting itself, as if remembering something it had almost forgotten. Then it moved into the water and was gone. Several days passed. He went out in the mornings and came back in the afternoons. He ate with his mother and slept and rose again. The sea continued in its ordinary way, giving what it gave, taking back what it took, indifferent to the small human lives on its edge, in the way that all large things are indifferent to the small things that live beside them, not hostile, simply vast. Then one morning, as he was sitting in his boat with his line in the water, something surfaced beside him. A turtle, large this time, fully grown, its shell the color of deep water, its movements the unhurried movements of a creature that has been alive for a very long time and has stopped being in a hurry about anything. It looked at him. He looked at it. There was a quality to its attention, something in the way it held itself in the water, something in the steadiness of its gaze, that made the looking feel mutual in a way that the looking of ordinary animals does not usually feel. Then it spoke, not in the way that animals speak in ordinary life, which is to say, it did not speak at all in ordinary life, but this was not ordinary life, and in the particular space of this story, the turtle spoke. It said, "I am the one you saved." It said, "You returned me to the sea when the children would have harmed me, and I have come to bring you something in return." It said, "There is a place beneath the water, a palace, a kingdom, a place where the princess of the sea makes her home, and I have been sent to take you there, if you will come." He looked at the turtle for a long time. He looked at the sea around him, the familiar water, the familiar sky, the line of the coast that he had known his whole life. He looked at his fishing line, hanging in the water, doing what it was supposed to do. Then he pulled the line in, set down his pole, and stepped onto the back of the turtle. The turtle moved into the water, and the water rose around him, and for a moment, just a moment, there was the cold shock of submersion, the gasp of something unexpected, the instinct to resist, and then that passed, and he could breathe. In dreams, this is unremarkable. In this story, it is unremarkable. The turtle moved, the water held him, and the breathing continued, and the world above the surface became a memory almost immediately. The descent was slow, not plunging, not falling, but descending in the way that a feather descends, or the way light descends through water, losing itself gradually in the deepening blue. The color of the water changed as they went deeper. At the surface, it had been the color of the morning sky, pale, almost silver, reflecting more than it contained. Deeper, it became green, the particular green of coastal water that has depth to it, a green that suggests all the life it contains without showing it directly. Deeper still, blue, a blue that deepened steadily, each shade darker than the last, until it became the blue of something that had never seen sunlight directly, but held the memory of it, the way very deep things hold the memory of what formed them at the surface. And then the palace appeared. It appeared the way things appear in dreams, not gradually, not as a distant shape that grows larger as you approach, but suddenly, completely, all at once. There it was, gold and silver and jade green, its towers rising in the water with the particular quality of things that do not need air or light to be what they are, self-sufficient, self-illuminating, lit by something that was not sunlight, but served the same purpose, a warmth that came from within the structure itself and radiated outward into the surrounding water. The gates were open, figures moved inside, not quite human, not quite fish, the inhabitants of a place that existed outside the categories of the world above. The turtle carried him through the gates. The sea in Japan is not a single thing. It is many things, depending on where you are, and what time of year it is, and what the weather is doing, and how deep you look into it. In the old province of Tango, on the coast of what is now called the Sea of Japan, in the northern part of what is today Kyoto Prefecture, the water has a particular quality in the early morning, before the sun is fully up, before the day has fully committed to itself. It is gray then, mostly, not the gray of something dull or absent, but the gray of something that contains all the other colors and has not yet decided which to be, a waiting gray, a gray that is paying attention. The fishermen who went out at that hour knew this gray well, were comfortable in it, had learned to read its variations, the slightly lighter gray of calm water, the slightly darker gray of depth, the almost invisible difference between the surface and the sky above it in those first moments of the morning. As the sun rose, the color changed. First a warmth along the horizon, not yet orange, not yet gold, but the suggestion of warmth, the intimation that something warmer was coming. Then the colors arriving, the sea going from gray to silver to blue, in a sequence that happened the same way every morning, and was somehow new every morning, the way things that are always the same are nonetheless always new when you are actually paying attention to them. He had paid attention to it every morning of his life. He had watched the sea change color more times than he could count, had sat in his boat in the slow brightening of the morning and watched the water do what the water always did, and felt the same quiet, something that he felt every morning, which was not quite gratitude and not quite wonder, but something between them, something that did not have a name, but was real. This was what he was leaving. When the turtle carried him down, when the water rose around him and the surface disappeared above, this was what he was leaving behind. The particular quality of the morning sea in the particular place where he had been born and grown up and become the person he was. He did not know, going down, that he would not come back to it. The princess was waiting. Otohime, the name means something like daughter of the deep, or princess of sound, or daughter of the sea. The name carries in its syllables the quality of water and depth and beauty that the person bearing it was said to embody. She was everything that the stories say she was, but the stories, trying to convey beauty of this kind, always run into the same problem. The language of beauty is not sufficient for beauty that is genuinely beyond the ordinary. You can say she was beautiful, and mean it completely, and still have conveyed almost nothing. She welcomed him, not as a guest exactly, not with the particular formality of a host receiving a stranger, but with the warmth of someone who has been expecting you and is glad you have arrived, who has made preparations not because courtesy requires it, but because the person coming matters to them. She said, "You have been kind to one of our own." She said, "The sea remembers kindness." She said, "Stay with us for a while. Rest, eat. Let us show you the world beneath the water, and when you are ready to return, we will bring you safely back." He looked around the palace. Every surface was worked in something precious, not in the way that human palaces are worked in precious things, with the heaviness of wealth asserting itself, but in the way of the natural world, where what is beautiful because it is what it is, not because it was chosen to make an impression. Shells of every kind, coral in colors that had no names in his language, fish that moved through the corridors of the palace as naturally as birds move through the corridors of a forest, as if the palace and the sea around it were not separate things but continuous, the boundary between inside and outside more suggestion than fact. He breathed. He was very far from the shore, he knew, and yet he was not afraid. The palace had its own version of night, not darkness exactly. The palace did not go dark. The light that came from within its walls did not extinguish at a particular hour the way a lamp extinguishes when someone blows it out, but the quality of the light changed. In the hours that corresponded to night above, not that anyone in the palace tracked the time above the surface, but there was something in the palace that responded to the rhythms of the world above it, some sensitivity to the turning of the earth that expressed itself in the light. In those hours, the light of the palace became softer, warmer, more interior, as if it had shifted its attention from the outward to the inward, from the display of the palace's beauty to the more private business of being a place where living things could rest. The fish slowed, the constant movement of the sea, the ceaseless small adjustments of the creatures that lived in it, the tail strokes and the small turns and the ongoing negotiation between each creature and the water around it. All of this slowed in the palace's version of the night. The large fish settled in the sheltered spaces of the palace's lower rooms. The smaller fish gathered in the coral formations at the edges of the rooms, their silver sides less bright in the softer light, their movements reduced to the minimum that keeping alive required. The water itself seemed stiller. Not still. Water is never entirely still, but less actively itself, more like something that is resting than something that is doing. He slept in these hours, not always easily. The strangeness of the place, the unfamiliarity of the sounds and the light and the quality of the air. These things disrupted sleep at first, in the way that any new place disrupts sleep at first. But gradually, he found it, found the rhythm that the palace offered, the particular quality of rest available in a place where time moved differently, where the urgency of the world above could not reach, where there was nothing he needed to do and nowhere he needed to be except here, in this room, in this light, breathing the air of a place that was entirely unlike any place he had been before. On the first day, Otohime showed him the palace, room after room, each one different, each one containing something that was not available in the world above, some quality of beauty or stillness or strangeness that the world above, for all its abundance, did not seem to have thought of. But the room that stopped him, the room he returned to in his mind long after they had moved on, was the room of the Four Seasons. It was a single room, large enough that its four walls could not be seen simultaneously from its center, and each wall opened onto a different world. The eastern wall showed spring, not a painting of spring, not a representation, but spring itself, as if the wall were simply absent, and beyond it lay the actual season, the actual light of a spring morning in Japan, where the cherry blossoms are at their fullest, and the air has the particular quality of a world that has just remembered how to be warm. The blossoms moved in a wind he could not feel. Petals fell in the slow, unhurried way of petals that have done their work and are now simply returning to the place they came from. The southern wall showed summer, the thick, heavy green of full summer, the green that has been building since spring and has arrived at its fullest expression, the green of a world that is completely alive and knows it. Cicadas sang somewhere in that summer, their sound coming through the opening the way all sounds come from a distance, a little reduced, a little softened, but recognizable, the particular sustained note of a Japanese summer that is as much heat as it is sound. Water was visible, a pond, perhaps, its surface covered with lotus flowers, red and white, their petals open to the summer light, in the particular way that lotus flowers open, which is fully and without reservation. The western wall showed autumn. The light was different here, the long, angled light of autumn afternoons, that particular gold that seems to be saying something, seems to be making a point about the quality of what remains when summer has passed. The leaves were turning, not all at once, the trees at different stages, some still green, some already brilliant in the reds and oranges that Japanese autumn produces, in colors that people travel from other countries to see, colors that seem impossible for something made of biology rather than pigment. The northern wall showed winter, snow, the particular quality of a Japanese winter morning when the snow has fallen in the night and the world has been simplified. The complex textures of trees and rooftops and paths all covered in the same white, the same even, patient white that makes everything look as if it has been waiting for this and is now finally at rest. He stood in the center of the room and looked at all four walls and felt something that had no name, the feeling of a person who has been shown something that the ordinary world does not usually allow you to see. All of time, all of the year, all of the turning of the seasons held still and present simultaneously, available all at once, none of it requiring you to wait. The days in the palace were unlike any days he had known. They had a different quality of time to them, not slower exactly, not faster, but differently organized, as if the usual architecture of a day had been rearranged into something that felt more spacious, less sequential, as if the things that happened did not have to happen in a particular order, and did not have to end before the next thing could begin. He ate. The food was unlike anything available on land, not because it was exotic, not because it contained unusual ingredients, but because it had been made with a quality of care and a quality of knowledge that produced in each dish exactly what the dish was trying to be, without excess, without lack, a kind of perfection that was not the perfection of effort, but the perfection of understanding. He slept in rooms whose walls were the colors of deep water and whose ceilings showed the slow movement of the sea above. The light filtered through many layers of water, arriving as something gentle and diffuse, and entirely unlike the light of any room he had slept in before. He talked with Otohime, not about anything in particular, not with the agenda of people who have things they need to accomplish before the conversation can end, but in the way that people talk when they are in the same place for reasons that do not require justification, when the talking is its own reason. He was shown more of the palace, the rooms he had not seen on the first day, the parts of the structure that extended into the sea around it, the places where the palace ended and the open ocean began, and the way that boundary was not a wall but a gradual diminishing, the architecture becoming less dense, more open, until there was nothing but water and the creatures that moved through it. He watched the fish. He had watched fish his whole life, had pulled them from the water, had handled them, had understood them as food and as livelihood, but he had never watched them like this, in their own element, doing what they did when no one was watching, the way they moved together, the shoals of small fish turning in unison, their silver sides catching the light simultaneously, the whole school bending and reforming in continuous response to something he could not perceive, was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. The turtle in Japanese culture is not simply an animal. It is a symbol, one of the oldest and most consistent symbols in the Japanese imaginative tradition, appearing in stories and paintings and poetry across more than 1,000 years with the same basic set of meanings, the same cluster of associations that the culture has decided to attach to it. The turtle lives a long time. This is the primary fact, the biological fact, from which all the symbolic meanings follow. A sea turtle can live for decades, sometimes for more than a century, moving through the ocean with the unhurried confidence of something that has no reason to hurry, that has more time available to it than it will ever need. In Japanese tradition, the crane lives 1,000 years, and the turtle lives 10,000. These are not biological claims, but mythological ones. The numbers chosen not for accuracy, but for what they express. A longevity so far beyond the human as to be effectively infinite. A relationship to time so different from the human relationship as to constitute a different kind of existence entirely. The turtle knows things we do not know. This is what the longevity implies, not just more time, but more experience, more accumulation of the particular wisdom that comes from having been alive in a changing world for long enough to see the patterns. The turtle that came to Urashima Taro was not simply returning a favor. It was doing what turtles do in the Japanese imagination, serving as an intermediary between the human world and the world beneath the water, between the ordinary time of human lives and the different time of the sea, between what is known and what is possible. He did not understand this when he stepped onto its back. He understood it only later, or perhaps never fully understood it, perhaps only felt it, the way you sometimes feel the significance of something that happened to you without being able to articulate what the significance is. He had been kind to a small creature on a beach one afternoon, and the sea had remembered. Then, one day, after how long he could not have said, though it felt like days, felt like a week perhaps, or a little more, he thought of his mother, not for the first time. She had been in the back of his mind the whole time he had been here, a presence that he had not attended to, because the present was so demanding, because the palace and Otohime and the fish and the 4 seasons had filled his attention so completely that there had been no space for what was not here. But now there was space, and into that space came his mother, came the image of her at the small house near the water, going about the work of her days without him, the cooking and the cleaning and the mending, the mornings when he did not come home with his catch, the evenings when she waited. He went to Otohime. He said, "I have been happy here." He said, "There is nothing in the world above that compares to what is here." He said, "But I am thinking of my mother, and I need to go back." Otohime listened. She did not argue. She did not tell him he was wrong to want this, or point out what he would be leaving, or suggest that his mother would understand, and that he should stay. She simply listened, and then she said, "I understand." And then she said, "There is something I must tell you, before you go." She said, "Time moves differently here. The days you have spent in the palace are not the same as the days that have passed in the world above." She said, "I cannot tell you exactly how long you have been gone. Time is not precise in that way, between here and there, but it has been longer than you think." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who is delivering news they cannot change and can only make easier to receive by delivering it with care. He thought of his mother. He thought of the small house by the water. He thought of the sea he had fished his whole life, and the shore he had walked his whole life, and the particular quality of the light on the water in the early morning when he went out. He said, "I need to go home." Ryugujo, the Dragon Palace, The name in Japanese carries more than the translation conveys. The character for dragon, the character for palace, together producing something that is not simply a royal residence under the sea, but something older and stranger, a place at the intersection of the human imagination and the ocean's depths, where the mythological and the geological meet. In the oldest versions of this story, the versions that appear in the 8th century chronicles, before the tale had settled into its familiar form, the place Urashima went to was not called the Dragon Palace at all. It was called Tokoyo no Kuni, the Eternal Land, the Everlasting Country, the place where time does not pass, and death does not come, and the seasons are always at their most beautiful moment. This is a very old idea, the idea of an eternal place that exists somewhere just outside the reach of ordinary human life, accessible only to the extraordinary, only to those who have been chosen or who have done something that sets them apart from the ordinary course of human experience. Every culture has a version of this place. The Greeks had their Elysian fields, the paradise at the edge of the world, where the heroic dead lived forever in a version of life perfected and made permanent. The Celts had their Tir na Nog, the land of the young, across the western sea, where a human who found their way there could live without aging for what felt like a short time and was in fact centuries. Japan had Tokoyo, the Eternal Land, the place beneath the water where Urashima Taro spent his days watching the fish and walking through the 4 seasons in a single room and talking with a princess who had been waiting for him longer than he knew. These stories persist because they speak to something real, not a real place, but a real experience. The experience of being so completely absorbed in something beautiful, so completely present in a moment that is unlike ordinary moments, that time seems to stop, or to move differently, or to become irrelevant to what is happening. Every person who has ever been completely, wholly present in a moment of great beauty or joy, every person who has looked up from something that absorbed them completely and been surprised to find that hours have passed, that person has been, briefly, in Tokoyo. Odoheim brought him a box. It was lacquered, the deep red of old lacquer, the kind that has many layers and many years in it, the kind that is warm to the touch and catches the light in a way that simpler surfaces do not. Its lid fitted perfectly, the particular perfect fit of things made by people who understand their craft completely, where there is no gap, no wobble, just one surface meeting another as if they were meant to be together. She held it out to him with both hands. She said, "This is for you, to take with you when you go." She said, "But there is one condition." She said, "You must never open it. Whatever is inside, whatever you might imagine is inside, whatever the box might seem to promise, do not open it." She said this simply, without drama, without the emphasis that would have suggested she knew what he would ultimately do. Simply, "Do not open it." He took the box with both hands. He felt its weight, the weight of something that contained something, though what he could not know, the weight of a mystery that was asking to remain a mystery. He looked at Otohime. She looked back at him with an expression he could not read, something between sadness and affection, something that contained within it the knowledge of what was about to happen, and the choice, made again, not to prevent it. He bowed. she bowed. The turtle appeared at his side, and he turned toward the gate of the palace and began the long ascent back through the layers of water to the world above. The shore looked the same, or almost the same. The line of the coast was familiar, the shape of the hills behind the village, the way the water moved against the rocks at the edge of the beach, the particular quality of the light on the sea in the afternoon. All of this was as he remembered, but something was different. He could not have said immediately what it was. It was more a feeling than an observation, the feeling of a person who has returned to a place they know well and senses, before they can articulate it, that something has changed. He walked up from the shore. The path was there, the familiar path from the water to the village, the one he had walked every day for his whole life, worn smooth by his feet and the feet of others who had made the same journey. But the path was different, not in its route. It went where it had always gone, but in its surface, in its edges, in the way the vegetation had grown up around it, in the particular state of overgrowth that happens when a path is not walked for a long time. He came to the village. The village was there, but the houses were not the houses he knew. Or rather, they were in the right places. The general arrangement of the village was the arrangement he remembered, but the specific houses, the specific walls and roofs and gates, some of them looked older than he remembered. Some had been replaced entirely. Some were simply different in ways he could not account for. He looked for his house. He found the place where his house had been. There was a different house there now, smaller, newer, belonging entirely to people he did not know, and who, when they saw him standing in front of it, looked at him with the mild curiosity of people looking at a stranger. He asked an old man he found near the well whether he knew the family of Urashima. The old man looked at him for a long moment. Then the old man said, "Urashima." He said it the way people say the names of things that exist in stories rather than in life, with recognition, but a recognition that belongs to a different category than the recognition of something known personally. He said, "I know the name. It is from a very long time ago. My grandfather's grandfather spoke of a family by that name. They lived here once, many generations past. The fisherman Urashima Taro. There is a story about him, that he went away to the sea and never came back. He walked through the village that was not his village. The streets went where the streets had always gone, the same general arrangement, the same relationship between the well and the temple and the path down to the sea, but everything that had filled those streets with the specific quality of a place he knew was gone, not the geography, the people. This is the particular grief of this story, not the aging, not the physical transformation that the smoke from the box brought, but the moment before that, the walking through the village, the asking the old man, the understanding arriving not all at once but in pieces, each piece a small additional loss. The house is different. The neighbors are not the neighbors. The old men at the harbor are not the old men he remembers. The children running in the street are the grandchildren of the grandchildren of the children he knew. He is not lost in an unfamiliar place. He is lost in a familiar place that has become unfamiliar, which is a stranger and more complete kind of lost. He asked after his mother. The old man paused when he asked this, paused in the way of someone who is trying to work out how to deliver something difficult to someone who does not yet know how difficult it is. He said, "The Urashima family." He said, "There was a woman, long ago, the mother of the fisherman who disappeared. She waited for him. For a long time she waited, going down to the shore every morning, watching the sea." He said, "She is part of the story, too. The mother who waited." People remembered her kindness, the patience with which she kept waiting, long after any reasonable hope had passed. He said this gently, with the consideration of a person who understands that he is speaking of someone the stranger before him might have known. He did not know how right he was. He stood at the edge of the sea with the box in his hands. The sun was going down. The sea was doing what the sea does at the end of the day, taking on the colors of the sunset, the golds and reds and deep oranges of a sky preparing itself for night, returning them in its own way with the slight softening and shifting that water applies to everything it reflects. It was beautiful. It was the sea he had known his whole life, and yet it was not the sea he had known his whole life, because the life he had known had been lived 300 years ago, or 400, or however many years had passed between the morning he stepped onto the turtle's back and this afternoon when he stood at the water's edge with no home to return to and no one who remembered him. He looked at the box. The lacquered surface caught the last of the light, the warm red deepened by the setting sun, the lid fitting perfectly. The mystery of what was inside, contained and sealed as Oto Jaime had intended it to be contained and sealed. Do not open it. He had not forgotten. He had not forgotten the instruction, had not forgotten the way she said it, had not forgotten the expression on her face when she handed it to him, the expression that knew, perhaps, that the instruction would ultimately not be followed, and gave it anyway, because the alternative was not to give it at all. He opened the box, not immediately, not carelessly, but deliberately, the way a person does the thing they know they should not do, when the not doing has become more impossible than the doing, when the weight of the unknown has become greater than the weight of whatever the knowing might bring. A white smoke rose from the box, cool and thin. It curled upward in the still air and dispersed slowly, moving away from him in the direction of the wind that was coming in off the sea. And as it dispersed, something happened to him. Something moved through him from the outside in, like the smoke itself entering and doing its work, and the years that had not touched him while he was in the palace came for him all at once. The sea was still there. This was the thing, above everything else, above the changed village and the unknown faces and the old man's careful words. The sea was still there, unchanged, doing what it had always done. He walked back down to it, not because he had a plan, not because he knew what he would do there, but because it was the thing that was still familiar, the one element of the world around him that had not been replaced by something he did not recognize. The sea was the sea, the same water, different water, in the literal sense. The water that had been here 3 centuries ago had long since moved on, exchanged itself with the wider ocean, been evaporated and rained down somewhere else, and made its way back. But the same sea, the same relationship between this coast and the water that met it, the same sound and smell and quality of presence. He stood at the edge of it. The evening light was doing what evening light does, taking on the particular warmth of a sky that is preparing for night, the sun low enough now that its light was traveling a longer path through the atmosphere and emerging amber and gold rather than the white of midday. The water reflected this, all the surface of the sea in front of him, all the way to the horizon, which was very far and very clear in the way that horizons are clear at the end of a calm day, was the color of the sky, gold and amber and deepening rose, the water holding the sky's colors, the way water holds things, faithfully, with a slight wavering, slightly more beautiful than the original. He held the box. He was not yet thinking about opening it. He was thinking about the sea, about all the mornings he had gone out on it, all the years of the water and the light and the catch, all the evenings when he had come back to this shore with the day's work done, and the house waiting, and his mother at the door. He was thinking about how all of that had happened here, in this exact place, in this water and this light, and yet had happened so long ago that it was now a story, the kind of story old men tell about the people who lived here before living memory. He was thinking, I am the story. Let us stay for a moment with this, with the question of time in this story, which is the question that the story has always been asking, beneath the turtles and the palaces and the lacquered boxes. Time is the central fact of human life, not in the sense that we talk about it most. We talk about time mostly in terms of not having enough of it moving too fast, of the deadline and the appointment, and the schedule that organize our days into units, and make the days themselves feel like containers for things, rather than things in themselves. But in a deeper sense, the fact that we move through time in one direction, the fact that we cannot go back, the fact that the moments we inhabit are leaving even as we inhabit them, become in the past while we are still inside them, requiring us to hold on to something that cannot be held. Urashima Taro's story is about what happens when you step outside of time's ordinary movement, when you enter a place where the usual rules do not apply, where the days pass differently, where you can look at all 4 seasons simultaneously from the center of a single room, and then return. The return is the heart of the story, not the adventure, not the palace, but the coming back and the discovery of what has changed while you were away. What has changed is everything, not the hills, not the sea. Those things move at a pace so slow as to be invisible over a human lifetime, but the people have changed entirely. The specific people who made the world what it was, his mother, the neighbors, the old fisherman he had grown up beside, all of them are gone, replaced by their descendants and their descendants' descendants, people who carry the genes of the people he knew, but none of the memories, none of the accumulated particulars of specific lives live together. This is what time does. Not the dramatic things, not the disasters and the catastrophes, but this quiet, inexorable replacement of one generation by the next, the world staying in roughly the same shape while the people who inhabit it are entirely exchanged at a pace that is invisible from inside a single life, but undeniable from outside it. Urashima Taro came back from outside time and saw this clearly, saw what the people still inside time cannot see, what requires the kind of distance that only an impossible journey can provide. Let it all soften now, the shore at the edge of the sea, the children and the small turtle in the sand, the long descent through the changing colors of the water, the palace of gold and jade and coral, the four walls showing spring and summer and autumn and winter all at once. Otoheim waiting, the days that passed like days while above them centuries turned, the box, red lacquered, perfectly sealed. The shore again, the village changed, the old man who remembered a name from a story rather than a person from his life, the white smoke rising, the years arriving. Let it dissolve gently, the way the smoke dissolved, dispersing into the sea air, thinning until it was part of the air itself, invisible, present without being locatable, the way all things that have happened become part of the atmosphere of a place without being visible in it. There is something in this story for sleep, not the loss, not the ending, but the palace. The place beneath the water where the seasons exist all at once, and time moves differently, and the days are spacious, and the present is fully present, without the usual urgency of the present, pressing it toward the future. That is what sleep is, a place outside the ordinary movement of time, a place where the days you carry with you, the worries, the plans, the unfinished things, wait outside the door, patient and unthreatening, available again in the morning, but not here now. Tonight, let yourself go down, not through water, through stillness, through the gradual deepening of the quiet that sleep makes possible. Let the colors change around you as you descend, from the bright surface of the waking day to the softer, deeper tones of the place beneath. Let the seasons be simultaneously present in the room of your dreaming, the spring that is somewhere in you, and the summer, and the autumn light, and the patient winter, all of it there, none of it requiring attention, simply present, simply what it is. There is nothing left to hold tonight. You are warm, and you are still, and you are exactly where you should be. Let your breathing slow. Let the quiet take you the way the water took him, gently, without force, down into the place where the ordinary rules do not apply. Rest well. Sleep well. Good night.